Assalamu alaikum and welcome to a new episode on Nafs and Therapy. I'm super excited and honored to have Dr. Abdallah Rothman with me here on the episode today. Dr. Rothman is really on Jed, someone who I cannot just simply say his credentials without mentioning how important he is to me, as he was my teacher and still is, and supervisor and advisor and mentor in the field. He is the student of Dr. Malik Badri. Dr. Badri wrote a bunch of amazing books like The Dilemma of Muslim Psychologists and الجوانب العاطفية في حياة الأنبياء, both of which are highly recommended books to read. Oh, Dr. Rothman is the founder of Dar Shifa, and he is the head of Islamic psychology at Cambridge Muslim College, where I did my diploma. And he's the co-founder and president of the International Association of Islamic Psychology. So, mashallah, he has a lot of beautiful credentials. And today he's going to be talking to us about his way of doing therapy as a Muslim convert who discovered the way of life when he became Muslim. And we're going to listen more about his story throughout the episode. Just as a reminder before we start, that this is not personal advice nor therapy. And please do take care of yourself at any point if you need to during the episode. So, assalamu alaikum, Dr. Abdallah.
Wa alaikum salam.
It's an honor to have you here. You were actually supposed to probably be the first episode ever on the podcast.
Oh, really? And just didn't work out that way, huh?
Yeah, subhanAllah. We had to
Well,
upload
thanks.
20 episodes before
I'm
I
honored
was
to have been considered as the first.
Absolutely. Well, you're my first pathway through Islamic psychology in the Cambridge program, and now through the Shifa method as well. So I feel like I'm happy sharing you with others and with the listeners and your expertise. So it would be beautiful to just hear a bit from your story of how you got here into Islamic psychology, and maybe, what got you here, if we can start with that.
All right. Bismillah. It's a long story and it's a big story. And I think just to answer it in a way that fits your context about talking about the way of working and sort of the clinical application is, my orientation to Islamic psychology is not really as a separate thing to Islam or a separate thing to psychology, really. It's kind of very integrated in the sense that I was studying psychology and I was studying religion and spirituality. I was a student of kind of seeking truth about the human soul. And that's what led me to discover Islamic psychology and at the same time, Islam. So I wasn't Muslim when I was making this exploration of the soul and trying to look for a science of the soul. And it was actually through the door of what Islam has to offer in understanding the human being and what we're talking about as Islamic psychology that actually drew me to Islam as my own spiritual path. So my whole view of Islamic psychology is very integral to my relationship to Islam and my own personal, istislam, my own personal sort of submitting was very much through the seeking of a framework and I would say a silsila or a chain of transmission of knowledge of how to activate the development of the human being from a spiritually grounded place.
Mm. Wow. Which is, you think, like, should be the basic knowledge of people growing up, whether as Muslims or like getting to know their religion? They should probably get this understanding of the soul exist, like, even without the term psychology, right?
Yeah, because, for a lot of people whose introduction to Islam is very much from a cultural, religious standpoint of this is our theological belief and these are the practices that we do and these are who we are as a people. It seems like for people like that who are born into Islam and kind of have this cultural religiosity orientation to Islam, the idea of the soul and learning about the development of the soul and this sort of spiritual transformation seems like an extra thing to people. Like it's somehow you could be into it or not into it. It's like, oh, isn't that interesting that that's a topic that you're interested in within Islam? Whereas when I read the Quran, I see that as a primary point of focus that Allah is teaching us about the laws of the human being and the nature of the soul, and that the whole sort of journey of the human being is not just about learning how to obey and fall in line with the rules that Allah has set out for Muslims, but it is actually seeing that Allah has given us a path for how to be human in a way that aligns with His reality. And that path very much involves a path of transformation.
Mm.
And so, and
Right.
and within that path of transformation and the sort of journey of Islam, meaning kind of, I see it as you're not just statically Muslim, you are on a journey of deepening your Islam and really becoming Muslim. And that path of becoming Muslim has a lot to do with the removal of veils on your heart, or the removal of disease on your heart, or we could say some people position it as the removal of sin or heedlessness, and the covering that comes on the heart. And so we see that from a religious standpoint as sort of a religious moral process. But I think it's important that we see it as a practical developmental process of psychology, which, psychology, not in the way that the West has more recently defined it as mental processes and behavior, but the study of the soul, the science of the whole human being that includes the spiritual dimension.
And where do you think like we went off with losing this kind of tradition?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I think in a sense we're built to go off of it. That's
Mm.
the delusion of the nafs al amara bil su, and the function of shaitan is for us to
Mhm.
forget, to
Uh-uh.
get away from the truth or the heart of the matter. But I think there's a tendency in the human being to cover over the truth and to stay with the delusion of the separation and the material realm. Like we exist in this dunya, and it's very easy to get caught up in the dunya and forget that we come from Allah and we return to Allah, that we have a prenatal existence and a post-mortem existence. And when we just get caught up in the material world and our sense of ourselves as separate, the nafs, that it's very easy to get into a space of materiality and cause and effect and mental, kind of cognition and self-direction. So that's, I think, just innate in the human being. But then I think historically and societally, if you look at just where things have happened, what has happened in the human story, the the removal of the spiritual from kind of mainstream thought
Mm.
definitely had an event of a turn of like the Enlightenment period, the Renaissance, the sort of, postmodern shift of the removal of the sacred. And with that removal of the sacred, even though Muslims who are religious and have this, you would assume a sacred tradition, their orientation to that sacred tradition can be very transactional and material, influenced by this kind of cognitive revolution of thought and, Cartesian dualism.
Right. 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 And as you were talking, I was just thinking about Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who lived like with people in Mauritania who were like very traditional practicing Muslims. And just thinking about those people, like those who are very much connected with the fitra, the people who are probably not as like engaged within the life as we are. Do you think they actually have better mental health? I mean, you probably don't know what like this group that I'm talking about, but in general, like the groups
Yeah.
that you work with, do you think those who are more like traditional, working with their fitra, working with people in different capacities, have better mental health?
Yes, absolutely. I do. And there's a lot of different factors involved in that. Part of it is living in accord with what is natural in nature, literally spending time in nature and being influenced and aligned with natural cycles and rhythms where we're not that positions a person to be a part of something, right? So it positions you to be conscious of and in submission to unicity and totality and tawheed. Whereas when we live in ways that are very individualized and focused on our own determinations, I'm going to determine when I go to sleep and when I get up and when I eat just based on I can do that. I have availability to do all those things. And so that puts me in a position of like my world then revolves around my own whims versus if I'm in submission to the natural order, my world revolves around the rhythm that has already been established in nature. And so that puts me in a state of submission, puts me in a state of Islam, whereas the other kind of takes me out of that. And so, but then there's also social factors to that. You know, when you live in a society that fundamentally is rooted in a belief of the sacred or a belief that, or even, I wouldn't even say belief, but like just an awareness and an understanding that there's a transcendent reality and that transcendent reality means that, you know, whatever's happening, even if it's uncomfortable and we experience it as horrible, that there's hikmah, there's wisdom in it. When you live in a world that is grounded on those beliefs, it's much easier to let go of things and like integrate, even when you experience trauma, to have the tools to let that find its place and integrate rather than carrying it around as if it's the end all be all and that you are personally responsible for holding that weight and that capacity. And so if you're, you know, this is where even like alignment with Aqidah in a way that is natural and fitraic, I would say, where like a person is able to embody the notion that Allah is in control of everything. And that means I'm going to do my part, but I'm going to leave the outcome to Allah. When the society that you live in operates that way and it's reinforced, then you're not going to have a precedent or a template to like hold on to everything and try to be in control of everything, which is where we get anxiety and panic attacks. And when we focus on all of the horrible things in the world without a belief that there's an actual reason and wisdom and in that, and that there's an akhirah, then that feeds into depression, you know? And so there's all of the weight that people carry in terms of mental health. And I would say this in the category of what Abu Zayd al-Balkhi first established as like exogenous depression, you know, meaning when you're depressed, because you asked about depression, when you're depressed from like life factors and context and environment, you know, the things that are external to you versus endogenous depression, where it's internal because of a biophysical or chemical cause, then, you know, I think people had just as much issues with mental health because of, well, I wouldn't even say just as much, but it's a different category when people are impacted and have depression from a physical means, then you need a physical solution. And traditional living probably would help to a degree, but it may not help completely. There still may need to be a substance or a physical remedy.
Right. So I have friends who tell me, I just want to go live in a like forest and stay with the sheeps and or like just
Yeah,
go live by the ocean, which I wish we can all do. And it was,
that's
yeah,
what I want to do.
yeah. And it's so interesting. We had this experience in California in the summer. In really like the just I noticed how my whole being was so um different when I was in the presence of God-centered people, that's one, and two, in the
Yeah.
presence of nature, and just the mindfulness of all the elements that were in the site that we were in Pescadero. It was just so integrative of this whole experience of what you're eating, what you're seeing, what you're smelling, everything. Before I go into, because I would love to talk a bit about the Shifa method and about the art and what we like, what you'd like to share about that. I want to backtrack for a second on the holding tight and letting go piece, which I personally sometimes struggle with. I see so many people who struggle with this. And I'm wondering if we want to put it in perspective in real life when someone wants to know why all their efforts to do something are not like what's the wisdom behind God not giving them something, or
Mm.
what's like there's the seeking for I want to know why this happened to me. There's always like sometimes this yearning to know more and to feed this part. So, how do you, in perspective, help patients kind of let go of that need of theirs when it's because
Mm.
sometimes it's not really attainable to know why God did
Right.
this?
Yeah, part of it is letting go of knowing in a particular way. I think people are so used to knowledge being from data and the accumulation of information and having things understood in this analytical way with their thinking mind, and there's this need to know the answer. And part of the letting go, which is really a fundamental aspect of faith, is trusting that Allah knows, that alim, Allah is alim, Allah is the one who knows. Allah is alim, and we are not. There isn't a way that we can know the full picture. And so when we have this obsession with trying to get control and know from our own self, it sort of positions us away from this station of being an Abdallah, or being in a state of ubudiyya, of servanthood and reliance on Allah. And when we can shift and kind of let go of the need to be in control and the need to be the one who knows, there's actually, and when we can shift into a place of being and more submission of our being into like trusting that Allah knows, then what can happen in that state of submission is that the knowing can actually be illuminated in your heart. And Allah speaks of this often in the Quran. When He speaks about knowledge, there's often a use of illumination or light, light coming into the heart. And I think this is where we need to recognize that knowledge, the heart has the ability to perceive things. And when the heart is not occluded, the heart can perceive things as they are. And so this is why in the Shifa method, we're trying to shift people into the heart, because there's a this yaqiluna aspect of the heart. The heart has the ability to perceive, and the heart is really the seat of the human being. So I think the need for people to know and to grasp from an intellectual standpoint, where their analytical mind needs to know the answer for things, is rooted in the delusion of self-direction and the need to be in control. And when the person shifts into this paradigm that Allah is the knower, and Allah is the one who knows, and Allah is the only one that can know the full picture of the reality, then when we let go of our need to be the one who knows, and we evoke the one who knows, then we can access that knowledge by shifting into a place of submission, right? So that when we shift into a place of, well, I'm going to let go of my need to control and to know, and I'm going to trust that Allah knows, and that Allah knows better than I know. And so I'm going to be in submission to what is, because whatever is being manifested is within Allah's hikmah. And then I'm going to shift. When I shift into a place of actual submission, we do that in the heart. The heart's ability to be in submission is connected to its ability to perceive. And so it's about shifting from this head-centered analytical way of knowing into a heart-centered allowance for the heart to be uncovered or untethered, and allow the heart has the ability to perceive things as they are. And its ability to do that is directly related to its relative state of purification. And so when we're deluded by our own self direction and this material realm of one-dimensional experience, then we get stuck and we get caught. And that can manifest not only in not knowing, but in having, diseases of the heart, which we experience in dysfunction. And when we let go of that and submit to the larger reality that we are needy of Allah and that we are servants of Allah, and we're sort of literally giving over the control, then what we can do is remove those veils on the heart and be in a state of submission. And then through that state of submission, through the giving up the need to know and the need to be in control because we are confident that Allah knows and Allah is in control, then what that allows that ability for Allah to illuminate knowledge in our heart so that we can actually come into knowing, but not through the collection of data or our intellectual capacity of the mind, but actually from a more spiritual illumination of the heart, because the heart is directly connected to Allah and Allah's knowledge. And so we actually have the ability, like I said, to perceive things as they are. And that perception of things as they are is through reflection, not through the accumulation of information.
And when I love that, actually, I really do. And do you notice when people or when we get stuck into in this process of unveiling the heart, what usually comes in the way of us being able to connect with the and with Allah?
I think ultimately it stems from fear of the unknown, and the fear of letting go. People, when we are occupying our individual self, we feel more stable and secure the more that we're in control. And so that preoccupation with staying up here and trying to figure out and is a part of getting control so that we can not feel like there's all this that we don't know about and that we're susceptible to. It's like the smaller that we can focus on, let me get a hold of this and let me know it, then I'm going to feel more safe. But then when people get into this part of themselves that they don't know and they can't figure out, and it's causing dysfunction and it's causing them to spiral out of control, then they kind of freeze and lock up. And even if they have a sense that if they could drop into their heart, they would get in touch with this deeper part of themselves, because they've spent so much time up here and spending, their way of coping is about getting their thoughts wrapped around things and knowing that entering into this place of the unknown of the heart, people are afraid to do that, and they just sort of cut it off completely. And then we're sort of led down that path in this over intellectualized way of being of the modern era. And then even within Islam, people who are Muslims and oriented towards religion and the understanding of the soul, it's so cognitive that any experiential aspect of like connecting with the heart is like, for a lot of people, off limits. And so they just disconnect and they stay up here. And then
Right.
that also, has a lot to do with just being disconnected from the body, because the heart, the metaphysical heart, has a physical location in the body, in the chest.
Oh,
And so I think the resistance is in the experiencing themselves in totality. We've become so sectioned off in our self-identification as I think, therefore I am, I'm my thoughts, and I'm my ability to intellectualize and to understand, that if I were to now include all the rest of the aspects of my being, the qalb and the ruh, which are really more central to who we are and more of the core of who and what we really are. But because we haven't been oriented to an embodied way of experiencing that, I think people just cut themselves off from even
right.
allowing themselves to experience it.
How do you maintain that connection with your body and with your
Me
heart?
personally,
Yeah, if you'd like to share.
yeah, I'd love to. Many factors. By remaining physically active, by connecting with my body and connecting my physical activity. So I work out, I'm in the gym, I do martial arts, I stretch. And part of that, all of that training of my body is integral with locating myself in space and time. So as I'm doing these physical activities, I'm breathing, so I'm connecting to breath, and I'm connecting my conscious awareness to my being and my body. So I'm like unifying my experience of the self,
Mm,
aql, qalb, ruh, and really getting a physical experience. But then I'm also connecting that physical experience to my ibadah, to my worship, and Islam does this for us. Like, this is why salah is physical. Prayer,
Mhm.
we stand, we bow, we bend. There's these physical movements that are activating our body, and that even each of the movements aligns with a metaphysical reality of submission. Like, even, just that the process of going deeper into submission physically in the body, it's awakening all of the integral parts of who we are, and it's like an active, embodied, lived aqidah, rather than just I'm sitting in my chair reading a book postulating about theological ideas. It's a lived Islam. It's not Islam as this, we perceive it to be as this organized religion that's about do's and don'ts and thinking, but it's actually the way of being in submission. And in order to be, my orientation to that is that in order for me to be Muslim, I have to reactivate my Islam ultimately, ideally, in every breath. Because in every breath, every moment, I have the potentiality to fall out of Islam, meaning not to, like, not become Muslim as my religious identity, but to not be in a state of submission. When I get caught up in my own world and my own self-direction, I can come out of remembering that I am needy of Allah and that I am reliant on Allah. And so what I'm doing, what I'm doing to answer your question, to kind of cultivate that state, is to bring my ibadah and bring my dhikr, my remembrance of Allah, into lived reality in everything that I do, from physical activity to what I eat and how I eat. So, part of that, we're told to do these things, like say Bismillah before you eat, right? But then it becomes this like religious ritual, like, okay, I'm supposed to say Bismillah. But really, we're supposed to be conscious while we're eating, so that we're awakened to the reality that, like, we should be thankful for Allah for providing, but also that the food, that the nutritional value that's in the food, in this like living way, is how Allah is sustaining us in the moment throughout the day. And our breath, we need to breathe, and Allah says He's breathed the ruh into us from His own spirit. And so making breathing voluntary and conscious throughout the day is another way to activate your conscious awareness of your ubudiyah and live from this place of rooted Islam rather than transactional kind of Islam.
So bring back kind of the meaning into the rituals and practices that we're doing.
Yeah, bringing back the meaning, but bringing back the embodiment and the
Yeah.
physical activation of it. And I
Right.
think this is where the connection to the Shifa method, and, like, so my understanding of healing and healing in the Islamic tradition has always been physical, and an integration of the theology, the physiology, and the psychology being completely intertwined and interwoven. And so
Right.
when somebody comes to me for therapy because they're having depression, anxiety, or they have some psychological issues or relationship issues, if I were to just talk to them about how they think about these things and then help restructure their thoughts, I'd only be dealing with like one small aspect of their being. And so if I'm really looking at afia from the Islamic perspective of well-being that involves the full, integral, holistic picture, then I need to be, yes, talking to them about the narrative of their story, but without too much time going by, I want to drop into the rest of their being, and how does their body respond to what they're going through? Where are they storing where are they storing some of this in their body, and how can we fully be present with where is the blockage that they're experiencing? And then usually, because of what we know about the anatomy of the soul, we know that the heart is the center of the human being. And so there's a spiritual core where you're going to have the kind of
Right.
emotional blockages or material that they're experiencing, maybe in behavior patterns or thought patterns. But so it's about going deeper and deeper into the root cause rather than just treating symptoms. And the only way that we can do that from what we know about the reality of the human being from Islam is by involving all of the different dimensions of the human being. And we do that most directly by accessing the physical body, which is why our prayer is embodied. It's all integral. And so this
Oh,
is really a central part of, I think, what I understand as Islamic psychology, but then the way that we teach this Shifa method is that our goal is to access Allah's healing. Allah is Ashafi. And so the Shifa is what we want to open ourselves to be able to receive, not necessarily trying to do some sort of method that removes symptoms.
right, right. And maybe it's a good time to do a small caveat towards the Shifa method for those who are not very familiar with it. I personally did the training of level 2 in the summer. So we have partly online and we have then in person. But I would love if you could just tell us a bit more about it and a bit more about how we got here to the Shifa method when it comes to the therapeutic arc. If we can go a bit into it, I think that would be super interesting for listeners to know about.
So I would say, in short, it's a heart-centered somatic method of therapy. And that means that when we hear about Islamic psychology, often the heart is referenced, the qalb, right? But because we've defined psychology so much by the West, we understand it as like mental processes and behavior. And so there's a lot of usual assumption that we're going to deal with thoughts and cognitions and behaviors, and then we're going to do that Islamically. And sure, there's a whole realm of how we can do that Islamically. But if we are to back up and redefine psychology from the ground up, from how Islam understands the soul, and that's integral, then therefore the body and the heart and the soul, like the ruh, the spiritual reality of the human being, not just the nafs, not just the temporary experience of ourselves as separate in this dunya, but our longer eternal trajectory of the ruh, then becomes like we want to bring that into reality in the space of what it is that we're dealing with when we're dealing with the human being. And so it's heart centered, not just in the notion of the heart being the center, but actually Allah tells us in the Quran, it's not the eyes that go blind, it's the hearts in the chest, sadr. And so this place in the body becomes actually very central to what we're working with in the Shifa method of how we're going to access the core of the human being rather than just dealing with tributaries. Like we can deal with the thoughts and the behaviors, but those are coming from some other core place in the human being deeper down in the iceberg. So I have this iceberg model that positions it of like, well, if we only deal with what's visible and right underneath the surface water line, so like the nafs and the aql, then we're kind of working in the dark with the majority of who we are as human beings, which is this qalb and the ruh, this spiritual dynamic. And so heart-centered somatic is that it's based on this notion that the jism, the body, is actually a dense manifestation of the soul. That the body isn't somehow just a container for the soul or separate from the soul, but that this is what the soul looks like in its material manifestation in this dimension. So if we want to deal with the actual soul, then we have to deal with the body because this is what it looks like here. And so it's a very practical method in
Right,
that we're dealing with the reality of the here and now, and because of that, it's very it's similar in some senses to Gestalt therapy in that we're dealing with what arises in the moment, like
right.
what is present now. And so often in psychodynamic or, traditional kind of psychotherapy, people will go into the past and talk about memories of childhood. We still deal with that, but we deal with it as it comes up in the moment and what's available in the body as we bring attention to presence in what's now. And so the from my experience, whatever's most important is going to rise to the surface based on where when we guide the person into their experience in the here and now. And so it's not that we don't deal with the story, the narrative, and the history, but we deal with it in terms of where it's living in and affecting them in the now.
Mhm.
And the best way to access that is how it manifests in the body. And through the body is how we then track to get to the spiritual heart, the core of the heart. And so that may mean that what we're doing in therapy, I usually would say that the talking about the person's story and the details really usually only happens like as an intake. Maybe that takes one session, two sessions to get like what is the story and what are they struggling with and what's the and then we want to drop in from this kind of, usually when people talk about their story, they look up, they're accessing this part of their brain because it's their relationship to what they understand about what they're going through and what they're experiencing. And that's cut off from the actual reality of what they're experiencing. And so what we want to do is understand that, get a bearing of what they're struggling with, and then drop into, okay, well, where is that? What's going on for you now? And how is it showing up in your body? And where is it positioning you in your heart? And then that will give us access to actually deal with the reality of the human being rather than just their ideas about what they're struggling with. So and that's where, most cognitive behavioral therapy is about coping with issues, whereas what we're trying to do is actually heal and transform at a core level.
Right. And this is why I love the Shifa method. And it's because I also love Gestalt therapy and I see how they so complement each other for me with the here and now. Because we could easily be stuck in just the past and what happened and just go on and on, which is, as you said, like we do touch on that, but in the here and now. And I have two thoughts that I'd like to share and ask you about. Maybe the first one is about um, when if somebody wants to get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they don't know, like they don't know enough about Allah, like they don't know that he's the Shafi. They don't really know him. They just know like culturally that I need to pray and I need to do all of that. What do you like? How is there a way, or do you usually like encourage them to get to know Allah at a certain way, or like with certain resources, or how would we want to open that door of knowledge for them as well?
I mean, it would depend on the client's orientation to
Mm,
Islam and their relationship to their notion of themselves as Muslim and their relationship to the deen. If they come in and they're like, I'm Muslim, I see Islam as my way of making sense of the world, it's how I want to align myself, then it opens up a whole door to guide them to resources to learn more about the deen in general, but also to understand kalam, to understand like theology and aqidah from a place that's more focused on how is it practically going to inform their experience of their lived human life and reorient their orientation to Islam as just that, as a map for how to do being human and kind of help shift their perspective from it being a list of do's and don'ts that is somehow transactional, but actually orient them towards it being a path that they have to participate in and that is potentially transformational if they use the tools and understand it as such as something that unlocks their potential. And so there's all kinds of resources, but I think the main thing of guiding people towards that knowledge is in orienting their understanding of how to their relationship with that knowledge and really underlying this transformational aspect of it. And then I think and there's some based on the knowledge of the practitioner, there's some of that can be done in session and or can be referred elsewhere. But then what you often will have a hard time finding resources to refer people to, which I think is really fundamental and key, is for people to have an experience of Allah, to have an experience of their relationship to Allah. And that, we
yeah.
talked about this notion that knowledge is something that can be illuminated in the heart and that the heart has the ability to perceive. And so there's only so much that you can know Allah through the acquisition of knowledge of who Allah is. There's a whole missing piece of that if you don't have ma'rifah, if you don't have experiential knowledge of Allah. And this is where one's active uh, cultivation of their own state of Islam, their submission in their heart, and allowing their being to come into an experience of submission. And that requires this place of the heart releasing things and doing some sort of removal so that there can be of the illumination coming in. Like the Prophet ﷺ said, "Astafti kalbak," and he went like this when he said it. He touched his chest. So consult your heart, and that process. There's this saying, "He who knows himself knows his Lord." What that means is when you do the work of self-knowledge and you're consulting your heart, you're self-reflecting, you're doing muhasabah, you're taking yourself into account, you're actively engaged in this process of knowing what is blocking you from being in complete witness of Allah, right? Being in a state of submission. And so this active pursuit of self-knowledge will lead you to actually coming into being able to witness, to have knowledge of Allah in a state of witnessing Allah. And that's what we're doing all of these practices for. Allah doesn't need us to pray. Allah tells us to pray because that's what we need to position ourselves to come into truly knowing Allah. And that's through an experience, through experiential knowledge.
I know that we're towards the end of our episode together, and I just want to highlight the interesting fact that a lot of the work that has been done on Islamic psychology has come from very much places outside the Arab world, which is like interesting for me that right now, like for example, Qatar is leading on the master's degree in the university, and some places are also like activating this whole interest again in Islamic psychology. And I would love to know from you, what do you think we're missing, or that we need kind of as practitioners, as Muslims, as people who want to evolve the field, to kind of work on in this region, in this part of the world, to let the field grow as well, and not it just be as well Europe centered or America centered.
Well, what are you missing in terms of like, what is it kind of getting at? Why is all this activation happening in the West, and why not in the
Or like, what
Arab?
can we do here?
I mean, I think what's missing, or what you can do here, what you can do there is take all of that development that's happening in the English speaking world and connect it to the Arabic speaking world that doesn't speak English. So I think,
Right.
and there's an irony in that, right? Because there's this all of this work in Arabic that the English speaking world isn't able to access, and there's this like translation that needs to happen from Arabic into English. But here's the thing, is like there is something about then retranslating that back into Arabic for the Arab world, because what does the West, as much as problematic as the West is, and I'm saying that like we got so far off because we were influenced by Western thought, there is something that happens in that cycle that when you rediscover something, you allow it to go through a process of revival. It's like rediscovering something anew. So like for myself, as an example, I wasn't born Muslim, nor am I from an Arab background. Arabic isn't my native tongue. I wasn't raised Muslim. And I came into discovering Islam from this blank slate. I was like looking at it without the baggage of it being delivered to me through this kind of cultural lens, or through like intergenerational trauma attached to what people do with Islam. And so I think what needs to happen for everybody in any case, but maybe more on a collective level in the Muslim world, is to be able to Islam from a fresh perspective in a way that doesn't get bound to how things were in the past. Because Islam has first principles. Islam doesn't change. Islam is perfect in itself, but our orientation to it must change in every generation and through every time. And the Prophet ﷺ keyed us into this, that every generation, the tradition is a living tradition, and we can only uphold that in its reality and totality is when we revive it in each era. And that means we have to look at it from the perspective of how we think now. If we keep referring back to our early predecessors and say, oh, that's how they did it and that's how it should be, they weren't people that we are. They didn't live in the same time. They didn't have the same paradigms in place. And so we've got to recognize that we've shifted a lot. And
Right.
even people who are in the Muslim world, who speak Arabic, who grew up with the orientation to the religion, in many ways have gotten far from the core of what it is. And they need to reestablish their orientation to Islam. And Professor Malik Badri, who was my teacher and the father of modern Islamic psychology, always said how he was so fascinated that in the Arab world, nobody was listening to him talking about Islamic psychology. He didn't have an audience. They were all saying, get out of here with this. Religion doesn't have a place in psychology. And it was when he went to the West, when he went to the US, that there was an interest in it and a platform for it. And that there's this idea of like Islam will rise in the West, or the truth will come from the West. And that doesn't mean that the West in their way of being and that paradigm has something beautiful in it, but it's this process of like going away, kind of like oftentimes we have to travel away from home in order to come back to the same place to see the beauty in what we had. Like I'm familiar with the story of the alchemist, or this kind of archetypal story of like going away from something to be able to see it for what it truly is. And so I
Right.
think, maybe there's something that the Muslim world and the Arabic speaking world could do to shift this perspective of approaching Islam and getting outside of the lens of seeing it so bound to religion and institutionalized religion and culture, and actually free it from the bounds of culture, and to see it as truth and as a path for humanity, not just as a singular religion of the Arabs.
Right. Haram, yani the West, I know we blame them for so many things, but some things we should take the blame for and appreciate that. Like, yeah, a lot of development happened there. And alhamdulillah, that's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know we have to wrap up, and I personally have enjoyed so much this conversation. Is there anything that you'd like to leave the listeners with? I'm going to link, inshallah, the website of Dar Shifa and some links and handles if somebody wants to check in the work. But is there anything that you'd like to leave us with?
I think I would just say, try briefly, and this kind of tied together, like, you've been asking me about the Shifa method and kind of my approach. And I think what I'd like to just underline is that if we're talking about an Islamic psychology, it's not us using what we know about Islam to manipulate what we're going to do in some sort of protocol to achieve an outcome of healing. It fundamentally has to be rooted in the knowledge that only Allah can heal, and only Allah is the destiny. Allah is the point of the journey, and the healing must come from Allah. And so our position in psychology, or doing work to be able to try to heal, is really has to be about facilitating Shifa, facilitating the process of Allah being able to administer the healing, not us as, we're just servants of a Shafi. Abdat Shafi is what we should all aim to become.
Oh, I love that. I love this ending. Thank you so much, Dr. Rothman, for your time, for all the work that you've put in, and really for this very useful, I think, episode, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Of course.